skill. Thank you very much.
My name is Andy Wilkinson. I teach in the Honors College. I teach creative process.
I'm an
engineer.
Songwriting.
I have an engineering degree.
No, I mean,
And I'm also artist in residence at the Southwest
okay.
Collection,
So you're
which is a place where we have an archive.
go to our computer science
And,
building, second floor, main office, or okay. So, oh, sorry.
Part of our archive is we have a lot of different things. But we have a good part of it is on creative process. Artists, visual artists, musicians, playwrights, novelists, writers of creative nonfiction, all sorts of things. And so since we only have an hour, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going around, but I would like to visit with you afterwards. And I would encourage you to come to visit us at the Southwest Collection. It's just right there, north of the library. And we have some really cool stuff, and you might find some things in there of interest to do research on or use in your research in topics all the way from wind energy to ranching to farming to social organization to cultural things, creative process, as I mentioned. So I would ask you or invite you to come out there. And those of you who are attending here as students, take my songwriting class. You don't have to be a musician or a songwriter. You just have to want to come hang out. But you'll write some songs. So, but today, all those songs really count as stories. My topic is how stories shape our universe, and I take that quite literally. How do stories shape our universe? Any of you in the sciences? A couple, 3, 4, 5, 4.5, maybe. I'm glad that you're here because we want to talk about that. A little over a year ago, I got a chance to do a keynote at a big gathering of storytellers called the National Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Elko, Nevada, which has been going on for 30 plus years. And the subject of that year was story. And foolishly, they wanted a 45-minute keynote, which I thought was torture to somebody, probably the people in the audience, but certainly those of us having to deliver it. But they were pretty insistent, so I thought, well, the only way to get through that alive is to do it in a way that's not just a blah, blah, blah speech. So what I did was I wrote that piece, that 45-minute piece, in poetry and song, which curiously, for a poetry gathering, had never been done before, which I was a little bit disappointed in. But my subject was story, and and that was a time when we were in a very difficult spot nationally in our political discourse, in our cultural discourse. And in that part of the West, you had lefty-leaning tree huggers and righty-leaning independent libertarian sorts, and they were all in the audience. And so and the curious thing is story is the one thing that can unite the furthest extremes. It's the one way that we have to communicate across divides. And so that's what the talk was about. But in the talk, I had to think about story. What is story? What does it mean? We use that word, we bandy it about a lot, as if we know what it is. And it turns out, the more I thought on it, the more I had to write on it. And you all know, as when you write, you think you know something until you start writing it. And then you realize exactly what the limits of your knowledge are, as well as maybe the limits of your ability to write it. So the writing process, which for that thing took me about 6 or 8 months, was incredibly valuable to me. It allowed me to think about story in a way that I had only intuited before. And so what I'm going to do for you today is, or do to you maybe, is I'm going to read a couple of sections of that poem, which had to do with story and how story actually shapes our universe. And then I think we'll have enough time to let me explain a little bit about that, about the science behind it, and maybe even, we might even think about the mathematics behind it, although I'm not really very good at that. But there's some interesting things to be said about story beyond sitting down for a bedtime story and all of that. One of the things that really got me started on this many, many years ago was the first time I read a poem by an American poet named Muriel Rukeyser, who died in, I want to say, the early 70s. She was a young woman through the First World War, lived through the Second World War and all that time. An interesting poet and one of the best writers on poetry you will ever come across. So I'd recommend her to you. There's a poem of hers called The Speed of Darkness, 1968. And the ninth stanza is this, and I'm just going to quote it to you. I'll read it to you. This is what got me going some years ago, thinking about how important story is to us. Time comes into it. Say it. Say it. The universe is made of stories, not of atoms. So this is part one of my big poem, which happens to be called Storyline. Part one, the universe is made from stories. A rose by any other name would smell as sweet, so saith sainted Billy Shakes. And I suppose if nose is all the difference makes, 'tis true enough. But what is right and what is meet is that the rose has name at all. What name? This name, that name, or these or those? It matters not at all so long as there is claim to call the thing by its own designation. For storytellers, you and I, we trade in appellations, just as merchants trade in goods, and just as hucksters trade in hopes, and just as preachers trade in souls, and just as lovers trade in hearts, and just as traders trade in trade. And so, though matters not which name, 'tis naming matters everything. Scarce words are seldom spent in vain, St. Billy said in commentaries, so let us build a dictionary to keep our ancient language young, that we may give our thoughts to tongue, that we may suit our acts to words, and thereby suit our words to actions. For lexicons are not abstractions. Our words, as with all living things, exist in motion, not in station. When written, mere approximations, ink and paper standing guard as temporary rail and post, momentarily, at most, cutting swath around a sward of unfenced open ranges. Morphemes corralled in caviards, bawling phonemes bunched in herds. Remember, these were cowboys I was talking about. Roots and stems with their affixes, branding hips and notching ears, even standing, never still, even sleeping, never silent. Always were and always will be restless, rustling, and vibrant. So let us stop and take a breath. Inhale, exhale, inhale again, and thereby set the rhythm of our breathing to our 2/4 hearts a beating, and set the fleeting, floating filaments of thoughts that billow, build, and blow across the complicated emptiness of consciousness, which we call mind, which clouds of complications we will call ideas, whose shapes we will call words. That cumulus of nouns, the thunderhead of verbs, the stratus of conjunctions, and the mist of prepositions, fogs of modifiers, vapors of pronouns and interjections. And therefore, because that breaths and hearts and clouds move only forwards, never backwards, and without moving cease to be, this rhythm and this beating and this flying, we'll name that time. Now that we have the building blocks, ideas and words and mind and time, for what remains of our discussion, we yet still need a few more rhymes. In consequence, then let us pen a few more ahead and pencil in a few more definitions. We'll begin by marking out the difference between both story and narration, which is only common sense. Narrations, each and every one, are told by someone, some narrator, while stories are too big to tell from narrations all collected, from all narrators, there and then and here and now, and all to be growing to one a single story. As grows that rose that smells so sweet, to bring this most important twist. Stories are the underpinnings. Since narrations have beginnings, middles, ends, they come complete. However long, however brief, but stories have no finish and have beginnings we can't know. And so of stories, we are always in the middle, in the midst. We fashion our narrations as our stories fashion us. Ourselves, narrations, grit and grist of all it was, of all it is. St. Muriel Rukeyser saith, everything is made of this. Part 2, time is story. Story is time. This is for all of us scientists. You notice I gratuitously included myself in the sciences. Time is story. Story is time. In the beginning, it's in the beginning, and ever after, once upon a time. The first creates us storytellers, you and I, who spin the yarn, who weave the cloth, who seed the tribes, who build the nations, who practice the holiest of vocations, from which the holiest work is wrought. For once upon a time narrations are in the beginning distillations, are glimpses of a bigger vision in slight, imperfect emanations, mysteries without precision that, when taken in summation, brush up almost against perfection before the mist, before the vapor takes them back, making one more metaphor for story. The knowing flying beyond learning. Narrations taking wing as birds, each bird a living, beating thing, come from flock to flock returning. The flock as being naught, as naught but bird that's to the highest power lifted. They set to flight the winged word that sets the spirit soaring, sets the gift of story to narration, which sets the universe in motion. Forget savants and theologians, all that they say, all that they know. Trust yourselves, your intuition, for everything from nothing grows. Creatio ex nihilo. Call it Big Bang, tree of life, unmoved, mover, breath of one, song of dream time, word kalam. In the beginning, the story begun with but one gift, with but the one, the giver come to be the gifted, the gift once given, come the giver. The story gives narration, gives the story, gives narration, gives the story, gives narration, gives the story, and all that separates the three is that all gifts in time move forward, never backward, never still. Onward, 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 onward. Stories make up everything. Stories. Stories always will. For there have been, and are still them, whose complicated, clever chatter, counting up the seraphim that dance upon the heads of pens, writing laws and formulae that leave out you and leave out me from joining in the deep discourse of intellectual intercourse. There are those, and have been them, whose bright and tangled, brainy blather favor mind above what matters, from Aristotle to Sir Isaac, Albert E., Bohr, Heisenberg, Erwin Schrödinger, and Cat. I'm supposed to laugh at that. Erwin Schrödinger and Cat. Costa de Beauregard and Bell, these architects who rent the rift between the arts and sciences, who opened up Pandora's box and left us with the consequences. Taking mystery from gift, taking gift from mystery, taking story out of time, taking time out of story, taking music out of rhyme. They're operatives and heirs apparent. The lab coat boys who built the clocks, the bosses who then took them over, the bankers who then took the bosses, took the profits, sold the losses, while all along their nights aberrant in this vacuum of narration built atom bombs in corporate nations, with 8 to 5 shuck and jivers, calendar reels, day planner jigs, all the while their money sings, what is time to a pig? Still on this day, there is a way. A way remains to balance out these miseries with hope. Hope, the stuff of love that sweet Pandora left within for a physicist and mathematician to add to satchel and to quiver, and so step back into the river which Heraclitus told us of. And that way is for us storytellers, us reciters, us musicians, for us to share our songs and stories with those few wandering theoreticians who leave their stale laboratories in search for unification. For there are some few, some astrophysical aesthetes, some shade tree quantum mechanical folk, some atom manglers, wild star wranglers, some few who mount the bucking bosons, snuffy quarks and leaping leptons. Isn't this fun? Some who ride the black holes out, entangling the entanglements across the big dark matter ranges, gathering from the scattered state of hybrid herd with shared genetics, from Isaac's bulls and Albert's cows in Max Planck's pastures, all so that they might mother up time with her lost equations. Nevertheless, 'tis up to us, 'tis up to me, 'tis up to you, we of the gather and the roundup, for it always is with knowing. We singers, tellers, poets, painters, we're the first to see new territory, the first to relate to new narrations. So let us share this revelation. Time moves at the speed of story. Okay, what does all that mean? It's interesting that as I was trying to learn something about time to deal with this wonderful quote from Muriel Rukeyser, the universe is made of stories, not of atoms. What did that mean? Was that just the poet talking? Because like most of you, I grew up on, what is now the sort of the current classic model of physics, Einstein's two theories of relativity, notion that time is one of those relative things. And so how do stories figure into that? And I began to read about some interesting work, a fellow named Elise Mollin. Any of you in physics? No physicists? He's from the Bronx, but lives in Canada, and that's where he works, who is convinced that if we're ever going to have a unified theory of cosmology, trying to get the small forces, big forces together, I guess in the middle forces, I don't know what they'll call them, that to do that, and he comes at this as a mathematician, not as a poet, that time is going to have to become an independent variable and not a dependent variable. And I trust his mathematics. I'm certainly not clever enough to go through them, but it convinced me. Not only that, I was hoping to be convinced because it makes a lot of sense to me. But the notion that the arrow of time is an interesting thing. And in the course of his deliberations, his mathematical deliberations, one of the things that he noted was, well, two things. One is that time always does move forward. If it's completely dependent, then it should be able to move backwards as well as forward, right? Like any other thing in the relativity sphere. But we don't have any evidence of that. We don't have any experiments that show that. We don't have any anecdotal evidence of that. So his notion is we should take that at face value, that time is a directional arrow and it doesn't work backwards. What is relative is the measurement of time. And I mentioned in my poem about Greenwich Mean Time and atomic clocks and all kinds of things that we use to measure. I don't know if you drive around town and you see the banks, with the temperature and time. My late friend Joe Carr, musician, mandolin player, used to call it the time and temperature wars, because every bank had a little different time, a little different temperature. I don't know, you want to put your money in a bank that's running fast or slow? I never could decide which, how that worked. But the relative nature of the measurement of time was something that bothered this physicist, Elise Mollin. And so his deduction was that the only natural way we have to measure time is through story. Isn't that cool? Story is how we measure time. And so let me read once more. I have to keep reading to you. That's not really what I want to do, but I did have to write a little summary of this so that for those of you who poetry puts you to sleep, and it's okay. It's got to be good for something. So, story is the home of the fourth dimension. That's my language, not the physicist. It's where time lives, time not being how stories are organized, but stories being how time is organized. For stories are more logical, more practical, more accurate in the way of everyday life, which is itself a story, right? Then are the physicists and others artificial arrangements, such as those clocks that I was talking about. That truth of time being neither eternal nor unchanging, simply a matter of agreement among the intelligentsia of a particular time and place. What is time? Whose calendar are we using? The Roman calendar, the Mayan calendar, the whatever. But storytellers, on the other hand, measure time by sunrise and sunset, noon and midnight, by the seasons, by the rise and fall of mountains, by the coming and going of wind, by the birthing and dying of creatures. Our storyteller chronometers being the rhythms and meters of words and melody. So in story, now is the anchor that separates the past from the future, from the sum of the stories that are yet to unfold, and where wait our untold hopes and fears, the expectations and anticipations and promises, excitements and anxieties, religions and ideals, but never the certainties. So that's what makes up the universe. It's all those stories, all that time. And when you add them all together, you get the universe, this thing that's Muriel Rukeyser was saying. Now, what's the useful part of that? I mean, it's nice to sit around and it makes good talk at a cocktail party, you know, say, here's what I think about time, and like everybody's up on the discussion as to what time is and what it isn't. But it turns out there's a practical value to it. As I mentioned, one of a couple of things that I teach here at the university, one is just called creative process in our honors college, and the other is songwriting, which is just a specific kind of creative process. So when I first started teaching these subjects, especially songwriting, because that's what I do, that's what I was doing for a living at the time, I thought very naively, all I have to do to teach this is to show people how I write a song, and they will learn how to write a song their own way. Well, you can imagine how that went over. It didn't work at all. And it didn't work mainly because I didn't really understand myself how my creative process worked. I knew when I was on track, I had developed some techniques for trying to get started when I was stuck. But it was all, at this time, intuitive, you know, after years and years of living and doing this thing, writing stories and writing songs. How did it really come together? So I had to think about it sort of like the physicist does. So at the start, that's what I'm going to show you today. At the start, I just thought about it in a way to sketch out an idea. Because one of the things that I find is that writing things out by hand helps me think. Sketching things out, even though you don't have to be an artist, sketching is really just a way of organizing things visually, whereas words are a way of organizing things with a construct that we make out of that thing we call mind. So when I started sketching it out, I wasn't thinking about time at all, but I was thinking about how we organize things and how I would get unstuck in my creative process. So time is coming to it. But I thought about what we know about the world, which is sort of this way. We know abstract, and concrete. And then I thought about, how do we know that? How do we understand it? I mean, how do we approach that? How do we come to it? Well, we do it through analysis and intuition. And so for a long time, I was thinking about these things as opposites. They tug and pull, and you go back and forth one to the other, until a friend of mine introduced me to something I'd read and not paid any attention to because it made no sense to me, and that was the philosophy of Heraclitus, the Greek, who is known for a number of things. One is that all the philosophers held him in high regard, but none of his philosophy survives. There are only little bits and pieces of it, and they're called the fragments. And you can find different translations of them, some better than others. Hamburger, I think, is the one that I like the best. I prefer to think of him as hamburger, because it's me and Wimpy, we like hamburgers, our favorite food. But he is well known for saying, you can never step twice into the same river. First those waters, now these. Meaning, as people have decided, that it is that river, but the water coming down it is different. And each time you step into it, you're different as well. So for Heraclitus, the whole notion of the world was caught up in the idea of change. But it was also change plus the fact that things weren't opposites. What seemed to be an opposite was just something in a different state. And so I thought about this abstract and concrete. About this time, my kids were little, and they were learning to speak. In fact, I'm trying to remember if they ever didn't know how to speak. Maybe there was a time. One of the things I noticed was that each of them, and every child I've been around since, when they learn the word chair, they already can use that word. I mean, this chair, this is a complicated chair, my goodness. It has a little springy back, which is very cool. It's got some clothy looking stuff. I guess it's cloth. Maybe it's some sort of polyester stuff. It's got parts. This has got like more parts than my first automobile. It has these leg-looking things that are kind of like a U thing with little feet at the end, and they roll around. But the child, the minute they learn that word, they have learned not just the concrete idea of chair, but they've learned something we could call chairness. They understand the abstract idea of a chair, and so they will use that word to any kind of chair. They'll look at a beanbag chair, even though they didn't go through the 60s like I did. They'll still look at it and say, that's a chair. And they'll look at a board sticking out of the wall at the McDonald's and say, that's a chair. And it can have 2 legs, 3 legs, 1 leg, mushroom shape. They understand chairness. So here's Heraclitus saying, really, the chair is both things. We just think of it as one way or the other, because that's what we do. But the chair hasn't changed. It doesn't alter it one smidgen. Now, that kind of holds the same for analysis and intuition. How do we know these things about the world? Well, how do we intuit things? We intuit things because we take them as a whole. We look at a thing and we go, oh, I get it. It's like, again, going back to my kids, the first time they saw the big wheel truck, you know, it didn't need to come with instructions. Little kids see the big wheel, they hop on it, and they ride all over. So we take it as a whole, and in fact, in the sciences, we call that holistic or holism. And the other way that we do it is we take things apart. So we could take a chair apart. We could say, there's a thing, a back, there's a seat, or some kind of support. We could analyze, we could take things apart. And so why is all this interesting? Well, what I found was that when I was having trouble in my creative process, it was because I was stuck way out in the outer boundaries of this little simple square. My college background was in sociology. We always used to say, only partly joking, that the second oldest occupation for humankind is classifying things. Anyway. So if you think about what's abstract and analytical, is just, it's an idea. It's a concept. There are a lot of words we could use, none of them quite exactly what we want. If it's abstract and it's intuitive, what is that? It's an emotion. In fact, it turns out that on this intuitive side, it's how we feel about things or react. And if it's on this side, it's things that we do or we act. So when we react to something abstractly, that's an emotional thing. If it's physical, it's a sensation. So I can be hot or cold, that makes me feel good or bad. I can be hungry, it makes me feel good or bad. You know, whatever the thing is. And then if we think about something that's concrete and has parts, these are steps. Now, why is all this important? Well, I got to thinking about when I got stuck, what I was doing was I was out of balance. And the worst thing, and I see this in my students, everybody wants to write about love in this songwriting class, and that's a good idea. We all know what that is, or we think we do. And there's a big market for love songs. I guess it makes sense. But the problem with writing about an emotion is that you suffer that real danger in creative work, which is you tell and you don't show. And what that means is, if I tell you, that's not a very good tea, is it? If I tell you I'm sad or happy, unless you really are committed to me or have some investment in me, after a while you're going to get tired of hearing me say that. You really don't care. However, if I can show you that I am sad or angry, or even better yet, if I can make you be sad or angry with me, then you're really interested. So when you're way out here on this emotional side, all you're doing is telling people about your feelings, and they actually don't care. So what do you have to do? Well, it's real simple. When you think about it in this way, you have to, let's add some detail. So if I'm in love with a beautiful gal. What is that gal like? Well, 5'2", eyes of blue. You can do all kinds of things. You want to describe her, or you want to tell something that happened, or you want to connect that to some bigger idea. What kind of a gal is she? In the 60s, maybe she was a girl lived in San Francisco with flowers in her hair, and you're going to San Francisco and you'll meet some pretty people there. Wow, that's how a song works, you know. And so I naively thought that this place where they all came together, this perfect balance, that was how the story lived. And so I thought, well, what is this? Man, this room is so high-tech, it has a high-tech eraser. I've never seen anything like it. Okay, if you don't mind, I'm going to just try some really bad art here. If we take this thing and put it on its side, and here's the analysis and the intuition, and here's the abstract, and pardon this terrible writing, and the concrete, I realize that this there was something that came out through the middle of it. And so at first I thought, this is truth. Remember, I'm from the 60s. Truth. But it's really not truth at all. That's terribly pretentious. But it has an arrow to it. And here's how I know it has an arrow, because when we're working in the creative process, we begin someplace. We begin with an emotion or an idea or a feeling, a physical feeling. Or we want to recount something. Like if you want to tell a story, in 1814 we took a little trip along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi, the Battle of New Orleans. You want to tell a story? Steps, the chronology. So you do things. So you start someplace, and maybe you start over here with that, I'm in love with a gal, and you say, oh, she's 5'2", eyes of blue, can she hoochie coochie coo? Whoa, there we got something going there. So eventually you're moving around these, and at some point you land on some thing that happens to you, and you have an understanding of what the story is about. Now, it's not an articulated understanding. It's more of a sense. And there's a great, what do we usually call it? The aha moment, right? The light bulb going on. But T.S. Eliot has a better name in this really long set of 4 poems called the Four Quartets. There's one called Burnt Norton, which is kind of an odd title, but it's the name of a house in England. And there's a place in there where he talks about the still point, how the dance moves around the point, neither from nor away, neither up nor down, neither back nor forward, only the still point. And yet without the still point there would be no dance, and there is only the dance. It's a beautiful passage. And I realized that's really what it's about. When we get this sense in our creative work or in our story that we know we're on the right track. And this was a thing I'd always noticed in my own work. You get that, but your work isn't done. You still have a lot more of this. And in fact, if you want to make this stylized, you can say, here's what I'm doing is I'm exploring, make this a cone, and then somewhere up here, you have to finish it. And you do the same thing. You go back and you look at the emotion. You go back and you investigate the analysis. You look at that intuitive notion, the abstract and the concrete. And somewhere out here is a product. And so you stop there and you say, that's my song, or that's my story, or that's my theory, or that's my whatever. So it addresses some really cool things. First of all, what do people hate to do when they're doing creative work? They hate to throw anything out, right? So when you write something, you've written 80,000 words, they only want 10, but I love those other 70,000 words. I slaved over them. They're beautiful. It's taken me my whole life to do these words. What am I going to do with them? Well, if we think about it, this is pretty bad math, so any of you who are real mathematicians, I tried to explain this to Lawrence Skubanek, and you know he's a really great mathematician. And he looked at me and he said, this is a little simplistic. But if you think about those 70,000 words, they're all in this time when we're exploring it before we get to the still point, right? So how many points or words or ideas or thoughts are in that three-dimensional thing down there? Infinite number, yeah. So how many are in that one? So, see where I'm going? That means that everything that you did down here is still up there. And which means it doesn't matter if you're in places there or it's there, which is the better song or story, the bigger one, the smaller one. Well, it turns out they're really the same. Intrinsically, they're really the same. And so I thought this is a great way to think about how we go about a story. And it's also descriptive of what happens in a story. And it's descriptive of why all that background comes to bear, and why when we tell the story of Gilgamesh, we are telling a story that's existed for thousands of years, and maybe years before that we don't even know about. Maybe it is just the one story. And that's what drove me to this idea about the storyline, because this thing, that's the storyline. And in fact, if we want to think about this as being a perfect circumstance, this is the ideal. What are most of our stories like? Well, here is the ideal. And so really our story, maybe with that I'm in love with a beautiful gal, maybe that starts here. And it's a little bit off skew, isn't it? It's not the exact story. And where it crosses this universal story, our narration, that's our still point. When we have that moment that we understand that we are connected to something much larger than we are, that is our moment of revelation. And so, does it matter that our story is our 5'2" eyes of blue gal that I'm in love with is not the same for everybody? Well, in some ways it is. There's a little part of it that's exactly the same. And there's also a little part of it that is part of the whole universal story, a much larger story. What would that story be? Well, boy meets girl, girl meets boy, person meets person. That is a big story. That's a story, the story of creativity of the universe. And so my narration, my song, my little piece of it, my part of that story, my narration connects in a way that I can prove to myself is part of a bigger thing. Now, so how does that shape us? Well, we're forever, I think, searching for that still point. There was a time in which we used to talk about having a midlife crisis. I am so far past midlife. I've had several crises. So for me, there was a first quarter crisis, a midlife crisis, a third quarter crisis. I think I'm headed for maybe sometime in the fourth quarter crisis. And it's existential doubt. You know, where do we fit? Because we've lost that, as the righteous brothers would have said, we've lost that love and feeling. We've missed that still point. We're always looking for this. We're always a work in progress. And the best thing that we can do for our work in progress rather, is to remember that we are part of a story. We are both being crafted by story, as I said in the poem, but we're also writing a narration, a part of a story. Rilke, I hope you all know Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke, German poet. I think he became a young adult late in the 19th century, maybe as the quintessential German poet. And he developed a kind of poetry that was way ahead of its time, but has since become influenced people like Dylan Thomas. And I'll butcher the German, but I'll try it anyway. It's a kind of poetry called Dingeditch, meaning a thing poem. The poem is the thing about which it is written. And the best example is his poem, The Panther, about a panther in the zoo in Berlin. And it's about the panther pacing back and forth. And the meter, even a kid raised in West Texas, whose German is not very good, I can even see in the German, on the facing page translation, you can see the meter. You can see the way the poem moves back and forth, just like the panther. That is so cool. Rilke, besides his contribution to poetry, he wrote an astounding book. Well, he didn't write it. It was compiled. And I would encourage every one of you to go out and buy this. It's a very small book. He had been asked by a young poet for advice, and Rilke was, it was like if I would write to Paul McCartney for songwriting advice, and Paul McCartney would have written me back. Well, that's kind of the way it was with Rilke and this poet, this young poet. And so the young poet saved those letters that Rilke sent back. And several generations later, his heirs collected them all and just published them. And it's just this brilliant, brilliant book about living a creative life, and about poetry. But one of the things I love that he said, which really is about story. The young poet said, the young poet was kind of whining. I don't know why Rilke kept writing him back. Probably what Paul McCartney would think about me. But it's this guy asking me this stuff. And he talks about it. The young poet said, if I had only gone to this school, if I'd only matriculated over here, if I'd only passed my exams over there, I'd have been appointed over here, and I would be well known by now. And Rilke kindly says, quit worrying about that. You don't have anything to do with that. Now, he didn't say the word story, but what he said was, he said, in any case, life is right. Ooh, that's cool, isn't it? In any case, the story is right, is what I take him to say. In any case, the story is right. So no matter how it develops, we can go back and look at that story, our story, and know that what it's led up to at this moment, that's the past. Now we have the future. We can try to shape it, but we don't have necessarily that much control over it. But we at least have had a hand in the crafting of our own narration. So, life is right. Letters to a young poet. What else do I want to leave you with? Then we'll have some stories, some time for question and commentary. A couple of other quotes. I'll just throw these at you. Besides, for those of you who doubt my poetic dabbling in the physics, Lee Smolin has a really readable book. If I can read it, trust me, you can read it. It's a couple of years old, called Time Reborn. And it's where he has that wonderful saying about how story is the only way we know to measure time. And then the other fellow is named Tim Maudlin. Now let's see if I have a good, I don't have a quick citation, but you can come on to both these people in another great thing that I'll recommend to you. There's an e-zine, is that the right word? E-magazine. It's out of Australia, called Eon. And they're like what we all believed Utne Reader would become. It's this wonderful distillation of ideas in culture and philosophy and in the arts that comes every day to your inbox, and you can choose to read it or not. And they will excerpt things from people like Tim Maudlin and Lee Smolin. And you can learn something about what's going on, what are the arguments in the world of physics and so forth. So I'd suggest that they're good things to read about story. But let me leave you with the last stanza of Muriel Rukeyser's beautiful poem. And I didn't write her name down for you, did I? Muriel Rukeyser. And the poem is called The Speed of Darkness. And it's a remarkable poem in a lot of ways. It was written in 1968, and she was really more of a child of the First World War and had been in Europe as Hitler began to take over things, and she was Jewish and escaped back to the United States just in time, and yet she was able to write late in her life as modern a poem as we have in American English for that century. So a really interesting person and worth reading. But here's the last stanza. My night awake, staring at the broad, rough jewel, the copper roof across the way, thinking of the poet yet unborn in this dark, who will be the throat of these hours. No, of those hours. Who will speak these days? If not I, if not you. That's my charge to you. You're the storyteller, and the story is up to you, at least insofar as you're willing to take the charge. Okay, questions, comments? You're ready for pizza?
I was going to say that in engineering, we're not so much of the story. I mean, here's the thermodynamics, here's the dynamics, or something, and don't incorporate. The students come with their stories of knowledge and things they've learned and why they're here, and how to connect the story of things in motion or things, electrical circuits or something. Those are different stories that tell you more, and how do you connect that? How does that make meaning to your learning, but also to your life? That would be a very powerful way to teach, because then it engages you. And then you don't have to learn it. You want to learn it because it's now part of who you are, and that moves you forward in time.
Yeah, I say that again, because I got lost in thinking about that notion. Say it just one more time. No, I mean how the study of the crafting of these, solving these engineering problems.
Yeah, so engineering problems. You have a mechanical professor here, and so we're not used to sort of telling the story of the thermodynamics or first order. And so how does that story enter into your life? Because you come with the story, how does it sort of change you and connect you so that that becomes your story moving forward? And so it doesn't become something you have to do, these problems or these things, something you want to do, because now it becomes a part of you. You've been engaged, been moved forward to this craft of engineering.
I say the main thing to think about is that this is exploration.
Yeah.
And only is this completion. And the other thing that I think is incredibly important is this statement. I don't care if we're talking about science. I don't care if we're talking about art. I don't care if we're talking about life. I don't care if we're talking about relationships. It's process and not product. And the minute, in the arts especially, but I think it's probably true in engineering.
Yes,
If the minute you think you know what the product is, you are dead. Picasso said, if you know what you're going to do before you start, why bother? That may be a real strict way of putting it, but the fact is, one of the great things about the scientific method is that it's process. In fact, what you try to do to prove the null hypothesis is to disprove a product, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in a sense, you're saying, let the process take me. And I know from my own work and from watching the work of my students is that if they forget about the product at which they will arrive when they're completing their process, or completing it at least for that moment, is far better, far more interesting, far more useful than if they had achieved the product they envisioned to start with. But most of the time, if you envision the product to begin with and say, this is my job to get that product, and here's how my song should look, and here's how my bridge should look, and here's how my circuit board should look, you're going to wind up not being able to even get to that. And if you do, it won't be as good as what would have happened on its own. Now, the reason I got lost when you were mentioning that, Andrew Verneuil shared a book with me. Do you have a question first?
Yes, but you can finish.
Well, he shared a book with me called The Tower and the Bridge. You're mechanical engineering, right? And electrical?
That's civil.
Civil. Well, this would have been, what is the guy's name? He's still teaching. Harvard, maybe. Where did Andrew go?
Up to the northwest somewhere. Wisconsin or Minnesota?
I can get if anybody's interested, I can get it, the site for you, but Andrew shared it with me. He said, you need to read this. I thought, Tower and the Bridge? It's a history of how we went from bridges made of wood to bridges made of stone to masonry and then to metal, steel, and then how we went from buildings that had a core, first wooden, then masonry, and then having the central core with the glass walls, and that was all very interesting. But the conclusion of the researcher, one of the conclusions was, and this is why Andrew had me read the whole book, was that one of the conclusions was the structures, particularly the towers, but also the bridges, that were the most efficient. In other words, they could stand the most stress, they could hold up the most weight, right? Were also the structures that were the most economic and were the most aesthetically pleasing. Isn't that cool? And I think that's because when you let the process, the telling of the story, if you let that unroll, then you're going to come out with something that is satisfactory in more ways than you can imagine. So that's what that was going through my mind when you were mentioning that. So
yeah, it's almost like the way to put it in your terms is sort of the intrinsic and the extrinsic.
Mhm.
The extrinsic being the product, and you focus on that, whereas the intrinsic is sort of the idea, sort of the thought process, the story.
yeah, and we can also think, if we want to, we can think of this as inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. It's interesting how we stack up things over here, and abstract and concrete, they kind of stay the same no matter what you do to them. But this is an odd, I mean, I know my topic is story, but I think this is essentially all about story, and story is all about this. It makes it easier for me to think about the whole notion of Big Bang, or when I was a kid, now this shows you what kind of geek I was. I wanted to be a scientist, and I actually read books like the debate between Fred Hoyle and George Gamow. George Gamow, I hope I'm saying that right, a Russian who had moved to the U.S., who was an astrophysicist, and Fred Hoyle was an English astrophysicist. Fred Hoyle was a proponent of the steady state theory, which is, stuff is being destroyed. As fast as it's being destroyed, it's being created, and so the universe is never going to be any different. Of course, that flew in the face of a lot of already well-known measurement. And so that was a big question going on at the time. And so thinking about how we understand the world, and how we don't do one or the other, we do them both, don't we? You get up every morning, the sun's coming up over there. At some point, you're going to go, well, tomorrow morning it's going to come up over there. And then you start thinking, well, why is that? Well, the sun rises. And sometime you'll think, well, no, maybe we're rolling forward this way. We live on a ball, and we're actually going into the sun. It's not moving. So then you come up with something that you can create a deductive model for and put it to work in science. Prove the null hypothesis. Let us explore that. We do that with our stories too. We have just so stories. That's a story that's completely artificial, meaning we know. And why do we think they're so boring? Even when we're little kids, it's because a just so story starts with a product. It starts with the ending. We know they're going to live happily ever after. Or we know that the ugly duckling is going to become a swan. And it doesn't take us very long, even as little kids, to say, that's why little kids really want to watch South Park. You don't want your little kids watching South Park, but it's all about process, not product like the Just So stories. But all the other stories that we tell, and we're out of time, but you had a question. Let me get to your question for you.
No, it's fine, because I was thinking, looking at that, when you say that it's called the explorer, right?
Yeah,
For us to,
exploration.
exploration, for us to get to the still point. So if we're using concrete and analysis, and if we're using our brain to control that process, then intuition and abstract it no longer exists. But at the same time, if we're using emotion to control that same exploration process, then concrete analysis no longer exists.
I wouldn't use the word control. I would use the word follow. Process we don't control. We follow.
So how come then that we are part of the story that we are then living at the
Because
same
we
time?
think we do what we do in our story, and we are conscious of our story, and we make our choices. But in the end, we're not in control of it. There are so many other things that happen. Late songwriter friend of mine named Chuck Pyle had this wonderful song, "You Can't Push the River." And I think about that when I think about story and process. You do your best when you can stay in the river and don't get smashed on the rocks, following the right. But you're following, you're not leading. And so when we're exploring, we're following, we're making a conscious decision. Well, if I'm way over here, I need more detail. But that doesn't mean we're controlling what's happening. We're just opening ourselves up to the detail that go along with this. We're opening ourselves up to the actions that have occurred. We're thinking about those now in a different way. And that's what we mean by exploring. So in an exploration, you really don't control anything, do you? You are letting it not control you, but you are following something to try to achieve, to get to someplace. And you only know when you can only know it in a way that it can't be expressed in words. I know when I'm writing and a thing comes to happen, it's that still point. It hits me like a ton of bricks. For me, it's often emotional.
So if our life is a storyline, what would you call the still point? Would it be like a internal realization, or necessarily, like, what would you label it?
Well, it's a recognition that that you're in the right spot on the storyline. Because let me make this a little clearer. This storyline, this is the big thing, and the part of your life that we know something about is this thing. And so when you cross that, there it is. Now, we're only talking about one part of your story. So how many other parts of your story could you have? Well, you could have a part that started over here and crossed at a different point, or you could have a part that started over here and crossed at another point. And so if you add up all these pairs of cones, that really is kind of the shape of our own lives. How many of you have changed your major at least once? Okay. I guarantee you, if I live long enough to come back, I'll change what I'm doing 2 or 3 times just because something gets interested.
Yeah.
How many of you have been in love more than once? Oh, you can admit it, we're not taking names. Even when you were a little kid, you were in and out of love, you were in and out of infatuation or whatever, so our big story, we're part of a big story, and we have lots of narrations that fit in. And that's why I think I didn't spend much time today except in the poem talking about narration.
Well, when I listen to you, I think about story like this is kind of a big picture of everything. So, always in my life, in my educational process, I love to see the big picture. So to see or hear the first from the very big distance, to see the something like Earth, let's say, right? We can see Earth from the distance, and we don't know yet anything about it. And when we approach from the big distance to go to the details, we can then recognize more and more intuitively or analytically or whatever. But first, we have to see, like the story would be like a sketch, like schematics, kind of from the distance. So we can see some shape, some interesting things that are going on over there, but we don't know yet them.
Yeah. So are you familiar with fractals? So if you take, like a seacoast is a fractal, turns out. In fact, let me put in a plug. 19th and 20th, Margaret Wertheim, we're gonna have her here on campus. Creative Process Commons, of which I'm a part, is going to be hosting her. She has this wonderful article on Eon that you can look up, and she has a great TED Talk. Her name, Margaret Wertheim. She is a great writer on sciences, and you can look up how to play mathematics, and what she's talking about is we have all this anxiety over math, and it turns out that corals routinely perform complex mathematical functions. And in fact, she and her sister created a crochet pattern that mimics what the corals do. And so when you crochet with that pattern, you get what looks like a coral reef. But she talks about this idea about, about the whole fractal notion of and how things like a shoreline is a very complicated mathematics that we're just now understanding in fractals. Well, you can also think about, instead of my cone model, which is just something I came up with because it made sense to me, you can also think of the big story is that big fractal line, and your part, as you zoom in, what does it look like? Looks like the big fractal line. So to me, we're all part of that same story. It's why us sitting in this room, we're various shades of skin color, we're various ages, we come from different places, yet how much alike are we in the real sense, in that big picture? Close to 100%. That's pretty interesting. And yet we look and we see how different. Our stories are all different. We each have our own story, yet we're all part of a very large story. Thank you very much. I'll be around. There's food.
You're an engineer?
Yeah.